Alternates have returned. People versus Robert Durst. Mr. Durst is present with Mr. Chesnoff, Mr. DeGuerin. People are represented by Mr. Bailey and Mr. Henderson, Mr. Miata, Mr. Milius, and we have transcripts, Mr. Henderson, and videotaped presentations.
Yes, Your Honor. Your Honor, do you mind if I do some work in the back?
You may go to the back, Mr. Chesnoff.
Thank you. Go to my room, Your Honor?
Pardon me?
Go to the room.
Go to your room, Mr. Chesnoff. Too many objections. Just teasing. I welcome all. I welcome it. All right, Mr. Henderson, which is next?
So we're asking to mark for identification People 74.
People 74.
That's a DVD of the conditional examination of Charles Lachman. It's going to be 1 hour and 11 minutes. We'd ask to mark the transcript as People 74A.
So marked. You may proceed.
You solemnly state that the testimony you're about to give in the house now pending before this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Please be seated. Please state and spell your first and last name.
Charles Lachman, C-H-A-R-L-E-S, L-A-C-H-M-A-N.
Thank you.
You may proceed, Mr. Lewin.
Your Honor,
Yeah.
Mr. Lachman, can you tell me what is your age?
66.
Can you tell me what is your current occupation?
I'm the executive producer of the TV show Inside Edition.
And how long have you had that position?
25 years or so.
And previous to that, at some point in your career, were you a reporter for the New York Post?
Yes.
And when were you a reporter for that entity?
1981 through 1988.
And as a reporter there, what were your responsibilities? What did you do there?
I was a general assignment reporter and go-to reporters.
And what does that mean in terms of you say general assignment? What does that mean?
I would be assigned to any stories that would have come up during the course of the day that the editors thought were worth pursuing.
And your education, can you tell me what kind of education you have when you go to school?
I'm a graduate of Berkeley College, 1974.
And is that with a bachelor's degree?
Yes.
Let me just ask you, as you sit here today, how do you feel about testifying in this case?
Not great.
And when you say not great, can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, I'd rather be out there than on witness stand. Just my background as a journalist and purely selfishly, I wasn't feeling good about flying, leaving my office in New York and flying here. But here I am.
And Mr. Lachman, being contacted for this case, have you expressed in the past, during our conversations, at any point, a concern about potentially your role as a journalist relating to what we're going to call privileged information?
Yes.
And you have a couple of attorneys here today, is that correct?
Yes.
And pursuant to the questions that you raised, was there an agreement made about what the subject and the kind of guidelines regarding questions I was going to ask you today?
Yes.
And were those discussions, were those made between you and I, or were those made between my office and your attorneys?
Yes.
The first or the second?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Were those negotiations regarding the scope of your testimony today, was that something that you and I negotiated? Was that something that was done between your lawyers and myself?
You and my lawyers, yes.
Is it fair to say that as you sit here today, you are in court because, in essence, you've been subpoenaed?
In essence, I think it was more of a threat than subpoena.
So, bottom line is you're here not because you want to be, but because we told you if you didn't come, you would have to use legal means to get you here.
That's correct.
When I say the name Kathy Durst, recognize?
Yes,
And when I say the name Robert Durst, is that a name you recognize?
yes.
Can you tell me how you recognize those names?
Well, back in the early 80s, I covered the Kathy Durst's disappearance in the New York Post.
Do you remember how you became involved in the story?
Honestly, I don't remember how it was assigned to me, so the short answer to that is no, I don't.
If I were to ask you in terms of that stage in your career, how big of a story was that to you personally?
A big story.
Was it at that point in your career, was it one of the bigger stories that you had worked on?
Well, I was a young reporter at the time, so I would have to say that it was a important story for both the Post and for me.
And was this a story that generated a lot of press attention, particularly in the New York area?
At the time, yes.
And pursuant to your work on the story, I'm going to get into more detail later, but you ended up securing a sit-down interview with Robert Durst.
Yes.
And how big of a, for lack of a better term, scoop was that for you?
It was a big scoop.
Did you work with another reporter on the series of articles that you either wrote or had a byline with for the New York Post at the time?
Yes.
And who was that?
Marsha Cranes.
And if you can you discuss what your role was with respect to her role in writing these stories?
Well, Marsha was one of the top rewrite people at the Post, and I was a reporter. I wrote stories. Sometimes I would call it in this case to Marsha perhaps. There were various editions of the Post at the time that were published, so we worked different shifts perhaps, and I would freshen up a story, she would freshen up one of my stories. We worked as a team.
So these are different editions. This is back when newspapers had multiple editions on the same day.
This was in the heyday.
Now we're lucky if we get one.
I got that right.
Can you tell me, do you think you wrote or co-wrote regarding Kathy Durst's disappearance somewhere in the area of 5 to 10 stories?
That sounds about right.
And have you had a chance to review the stories that you and Ms. Cranes wrote regarding Kathy Durst's disappearance?
Yes.
And I want to talk about for a moment how your, how your procedure would go when you would interview a source for a story. If you end up printing, you use someone's name, you say, for instance, John Smith told me so-and-so, you quote John Smith, would that mean that that's an interview that you conduct?
Probably.
And in fact, if you were interviewing an individual and you were going to document what they said, how did you do it at that time?
I would take notes. If it was a phone interview, it would be me handwriting notes or typing it right into the computer. If it was a recorded conversation, it would be me with an open mic recording the conversation and then transcribing the notes.
How important was it for you to be accurate in what you attributed to someone?
Very important.
Is it fair to say that if you quote somebody and the quotes are inaccurate, that could have severe professional consequences for the reporter?
Yes.
In terms of reviewing the articles in this case, is there anything about the articles you reviewed, the notes that you reviewed, with respect to those articles, that lead you to believe that they are anything other than accurate in terms of what you are reporting people told you?
That's true. They are accurate.
And is it fair to say also, this might sound like a silly question, that although you can accurately attribute what somebody tells you, you cannot accurately say whether what they're telling you is truthful?
Yes.
One moment. Have you had a chance to review the notes that you took with respect to covering this story?
Some of them, yes.
And in looking at the notes and the articles that you or Marcia Green put on the story, is it fair to say that they demonstrated that you conducted interviews with Susan Berman and Robert Durst in relation to these stories?
I think it's fair to say that, yes.
And is it also fair to say that you had contact with Kathy's friends and family, Kathy Durst's friends and family, while you were working on the story?
Yes.
I want to talk about an article that I would like to mark your honor as equals 74.
Yep.
This is going to be a 2-page, dated 6/3/82.
Yes.
Have you been shown?
I'm sorry, please wait. Giving him his apartment 81 souvenir water. I just take that with me as a memento.
You ready for the resume round?
Yes.
Having shown this Marcus People 74, you had a chance to look at this article, is that correct?
Yes.
And this is an article from Thursday, June 3rd, 1982, is that correct?
Yes.
And in fact, it has the byline, it says on the right side, Charles Lachman, and it's titled, "You Be Tortured by Husband's Romance with Mia Farrow's Sister," is that correct?
Yes.
And the Charles Lachman, that's you, is that correct?
Yes.
For the record, people 74 is 2B.
Thank you.
Mr. Lachman, pursuant to this report, did you conduct an interview with Robert Durst?
Yes.
Was that interview, to the best of your memory, was that in person or over the phone?
In person?
As you sit here today, do you see an individual that appears to be the person interviewed?
Yes.
And can you please indicate what that person's wearing and where they're located?
He's sitting at defense counsel's table. He's wearing a blue blazer, has glasses, white shirt.
The witness is identified by defendant Robert Durst.
In reviewing this article, does it accurately depict what Mr. Durst personally said to you during your interview?
Yes.
And as you sit here today, do you have a full and complete memory of what that information was that Mr. Durst provided to you?
Well, I'm not sure how to respond. I mean, it happened more than 36 years ago, so...
Well, it's not a trick question. If you're saying, no, you don't have a full and complete memory, that's certainly fine. Some people have photographic memories and they'd be able to remember, I don't know who that might be. Okay, so the answer would be no. Do you have a full and complete memory of what Mr. Durst said to you as you sit here today in this interview?
No.
So if you can, Mr. Locker, can you please read the yellow?
Yes.
It's on the screen, whatever it is you're from.
I'll go with the screen, it's a little bigger. The Post also spoke with Robert Durst, who was offering an unspecified reward for information leading to his wife's whereabouts. Durst said, quote, "I think Kathy is alive," close quote. He suggested his wife ran away because she suffered, quote, "some sort of quasi-breakdown," close quote. Quote, "Kathy was doing badly in medical school, and she was doing badly in our life," She was unhappy. All I want to know is that she's someplace and she's all right. I'm not trying to drag her back, close quote. In the interview, Durst, the 39-year-old scion to a real estate empire headed by his multimillionaire father, Seymour, considered to be one of the city's 5 biggest landlords, acknowledged his past affair with Prudence Farrow, who is married and works as a secretary. Durst also spoke of the anger and frustration that marked his marriage to Kathy. Quote, Kathy and I have been having marital problems for several years.
Turning to the page. Can you see that? I'm going to try to zoom in a little more.
Now, okay. We were going back and forth. My wife and I didn't live together from June of '80. Then she moved into my Riverside Drive apartment in April '81. During that time, we both had relationships, close quote. Asked to describe his relationship with Miss Farrow at the time Kathy disappeared, Durst said, quote, not an intimate relationship. Ellipsis, we're still good friends. When Kathy and I got back together for the last time, Prudence Farrow.
I'm sorry, you're not reading the words correctly. So, after when Kathy and I got back together, I think you misspoke. You said last.
Sorry.
For the last time, it's the last thing. So, I'll let
Sorry, you were reading. Sorry. Sorry.
Right.
When Kathy and I got back together, the last thing Prudence Farrow wanted to do was see me. Kathy knew about Prudence Farrow from the very beginning, close quote. He then declared, quote, Kathy had become, whatever word you want to use, ellipsis, she did cocaine, close quote. He wondered whether Kathy's cocaine habit got her involved with bad elements who might somehow be responsible for her disappearance. Durst informed Kathy's family and the police Thursday night that his wife was gone. The Post found that Kathy's lawyers were negotiating a financial agreement with her husband's attorneys. Durst said he was very troubled about the negotiations because he had to supply Kathy's attorney with revelatory personal financial records. The Durst organization is privately held, and Durst said, quote, it's very, very unpleasant making a disclosure of your family's assets and trusts. None of that stuff has been disclosed out of the family, close quote, since his aunt and uncle got divorced more than 2 decades ago. He volunteered, quote, we had a big argument about it, close quote.
Having gone through this part of the article, again, I know you said that you do not remember specifically what Mr. Durst told you, but is there anything that leads you to believe that that was not an accurate recitation of what Mr. Durst would have said to you?
I believe it was accurate.
Pursuant to your work on this case, on this story, excuse me, do the notes and stories that you reviewed, do they indicate that you spoke to a woman named Susan Berman?
Yes.
As you sit here today, you have an actual memory of sitting down and speaking to Susan Berman?
No.
Having reviewed your notes, do your notes indicate that you yourself had at least one conversation with Susan Berman where you took notes?
They appear to indicate that, yes.
And given the notes that you had a chance to review those notes, correct?
Yes.
And do those notes that describe an interview with Susan Berman, do those appear to be your notes?
Yes.
This time I'd like to mark it as Article 75. 5-page document, Your Honor.
Yeah.
Can I approach?
Yes.
You've had a chance to review these 5 pages, these notes previously, is that correct?
Yes.
And can you tell me, do you recognize the format of those notes?
Yes.
And can you tell me what you recognize?
I believe they were notes taken, printed out from the New York Post computer.
And can you tell me how it is that you come to that conclusion?
Well, I recognize the font. I also recognize the old-fashioned sprockets on the side. Back in the day, the paper used to come out in a kind of a mass roll of paper.
I'm old enough to remember that. And by the way, reviewing those notes, were you aware of what your habit and custom was as to how you would interview individuals and how your notes would end up on a document like that?
Yes.
Can you please describe that process, please?
Well, if it would be a phone interview, I would probably be writing the quotes and the information directly into the computer that I was using. If it was an interview that was done out of house, I would come back with either notes or a tape recording and put them into the computer.
And by the way, whether you are typing directly into the computer or you are transferring and taking notes, are you writing down the information contemporaneously with your interview?
In most cases, yes.
And when you say in most cases, can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, I would imagine there would be circumstances where they wouldn't be necessarily contemporaneous. I would find some information and put it in the ongoing file that I would have on the story.
When you have looked at these notes, specifically, these notes appear to be notes of an interview or interviews you had with Ms. Berman.
Yes.
And given that foundation, does it appear to you that these notes would have been taken, either written down at the time you interviewed her, and then transferred from that onto this New York Post system, or that they would have been directly put into the computer after you conducted the interview?
Probably.
As you sit here today, do you have a full and complete memory of specifically what Susan Berman told you?
No.
Brother, can I meet the witness stand one here?
Yeah, thank you. I'll let Mr. Chesnoff take the witness on board here.
Did you keep possession of the computer that these notes would have been contained on?
No.
Would that be at the New York Post archive somewhere?
I don't know, sir.
Do you know if those are a complete set of your notes?
I don't know.
Did you ever figure out how the notes got in the hands of law enforcement?
I don't know how.
Did you give them to them?
No.
Did you give your notes to other people besides law enforcement?
I don't remember.
Do you think you may have given the notes to Kathy's family?
I'd be guessing.
That you remember being interviewed by Mr. Malone and the police?
Yes.
So you don't really have any way to know whether or not those are actually your original notes in their original form, do you?
They appear to be my original notes.
Lachman, I'm not trying to be argumentative, and I know you, based on your prior answers, so answer as best you can in 2018. As you sit there, you cannot tell His Honor that you know that those are actually the notes that were created by you in 1982, can you?
Can I review the notes for a moment?
Please.
I'm sorry, I don't know how to respond to that question. I think these are my notes.
It's hard to communicate from the start, indicate what it is saying. Let me just ask two follow-up questions, just so the record's clear on this. The notes that you are referring to, you recognize as having been on the format of the special proprietary New York Post system that you utilized back in time before working with Post in 1982, is that correct?
Well, I'm not sure whether it was proprietary or not. They appear to be the notes from the New York Post computer.
Right, and what I'm saying is, in essence, the New York Post had a computer system that you use that reporters have access to. Is it fair to say this appears to be notes that are from that computer system?
Yes.
And do you see any indication in looking at the document that there is anything that appears to you to raise concern that these have been altered either way?
No.
And in going through it, are there in fact expressions and phrasing and just the way it's written that you recognize as being your style and how you would take these notes?
Yes.
And has it previously related to me in a taped interview provided to the defense that exact information?
Yes.
All right, please go ahead and read it.
Susan Berman, colon.
Let me stop you. When it says Susan Berman, colon, what does that mean to you?
Well, based on the fact that there are quotation marks in the subsequent sentence, I am presuming that means it's a direct quote from Susan Berman.
Okay, please continue.
Susan Berman, colon, quote, I can't imagine he'd do anything to her, period. Maybe, dear God.
In looking at that statement, can't imagine he can do anything to her, maybe dear God. To the best of your understanding, does it appear that the he that is referring to is Mr. Durst?
Yes. Durst's office, and here's a number. Do I read the number?
Yeah, you need to read
He's in town until next Wednesday. I assume he's still under, and then it's INV, which is my shorthand for investigation.
it. And as you sit here today, do you know when you assume, when you say, quote, or I assume he's still under investigation, who that's referring to?
Yes.
Who is that?
Robert Durst.
Thank you. Please continue.
Quote, the last year of their marriage was a complete disaster. This is a man who loved her very deeply, close quote. Then it gives a number for Gilberta Najami.
Let me just stop you. Because this is under the heading of Susan Berman with a colon, does that mean to you that this information is coming from Susan Berman or not?
I don't think so.
It says, Prudence leaving Florida, screenplay exotic. Do you know where that information is coming from?
Not really.
Okay. I want to go down the next part. It says he's not a media wise guy. He was a hippie. And it says a PROF. What does that mean?
I believe that's my shorthand for professional.
And do you know that information? Do you know who that is describing and where it's coming from? Do you know, first of all, who is making that statement? Is that something Susan Berman is telling you? Is that something you're just noting? Do you know where that's coming from?
I don't know. I can guess, but I don't know.
Well, I don't want you to guess. What I want you to do is, based on is there any indication if you see Susan Berman on top, and then you see we're going to head down and it's going to be Sue Berman with a colon, does that tell you anything about where this statement, he's not a media-wise guy, he was a hippie, a prof, where that would have been coming from?
It definitely gives me a clue.
Okay, and what would your clue be based on how you wrote in your habit of Justin?
Susan Berman.
Okay. I want you to go then to below that. Oh, I'm sorry, and do you know who that would have been describing?
Robert Durst.
All right, I want you to go to the next part that says, it starts with page 003 and it has a time.
Can you pull up the yield paper?
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry about that. It's a little harder to read now. Can you say it? Do you need me to zoom a little closer?
No, I'm okay.
Okay.
Sue Berman, colon, he says Kathy was never admitted to Jacoby. He never beat her up. He's flabbergasted. He's very, very upset. He's terribly, terribly upset by this. I don't know whether he knew or not. The only 2 bits of info.
So let me stop. Does that mean that Susan Berman was telling you, he says Kathy was never admitted to Jacoby, he never beat her up, he's flabbergasted, that's coming from Susan Berman?
I believe so.
And is that Susan Berman, to the best of your knowledge, describing Bob Durst and what he is feeling? The he is Bob Durst, is that correct?
Yes.
And the next part, again, the he is Bob Durst about being very, very upset.
Yes.
And the next sentence, that he's terribly, terribly upset by this, and I don't know whether he or not that he is again Bob Durst.
Yes.
What does it mean, the only 2 bits of info? Do you know what that means or no?
Is this the next page? Can they do something on top of the next page?
Yes, so the next page has the, it starts and continues on right with the copy. This is
Gotcha.
where you were the only 2 bits of info. And then it says interview with Bob Durst.
I don't know what that means.
Okay, what it, based on your, it's not in quotes, would that mean that it is likely something you are noting to yourself, or is it something coming from Susan Berman? Do you have any idea or no?
I don't know.
Okay. Do you recall conducting an interview with Robert Durst where you again took notes?
Yes.
And you had a chance to look. I'm now on, this is page 2. Page 2 talks about, one moment. You know, I think the way that we mark this, which is minor, I thought we had it different, but I think we marked it, as I said, this was a 5-page document that involved the notes of the interview with Susan Berman. It should have been marked as a 5-page document that has the notes of Susan Berman, then it has the notes of the interview with Robert Durst.
Thanks a lot, Ben.
Thank you. With respect to, I want to talk about your interview with Mr. Durst. With respect to the process, is it the same, in other words, of how you would either record at the time, take notes at the time, and then transcribe, as you previously discussed with respect to Susan Berman?
Yes.
And having reviewed these notes, is there anything about these notes that leads you to believe that they are inaccurate in terms of what Mr. Durst said to you?
No.
And as you sit here today, do you have a full and complete memory of what Mr. Durst said to you during this interview?
No.
All right, well, you can start with, it says, the interview with Bob Durst. Is it close enough? Do you want me to? It's a little better.
Asked about new developments in the case, colon, quote, nothing meaningful. Periodically reports of a woman in a morgue or a woman in a mental institution, which I checked out. Police, colon. I feel they've gone above and beyond the call of duty. Gut feeling, whether she is alive or dead. Quotation, quote, it depends on how I feel. If I'm feeling good, I hope she's alive someplace.
Let me stop you. And these were all things that Bob Durst is telling you directly, is that correct?
Yes,
And when it says, so for instance, when it says police in colon, and then you have a quotation, that's Mr. Durst responding to how he feels about the police, is that correct?
I believe so.
And we can continue, we're at the part that says the allegation.
The allegations that Gilberta Najami was making to the Lewisboro Ledger, colon, up until now the New York papers have been uninterested in reporting something as obnoxious as what she's saying.
Is that a statement that's coming from Mr. Durst?
I believe so.
I just want to be clear, you would not be editorializing. That wouldn't be you giving your opinion, correct?
No.
And you're only interviewing Robert Durst in these notes, correct?
I believe so.
All right, please continue.
Repeated beatings,
That has a colon as well, right?
colon,
And that's going to mean this is going to be you asking about the allegation of repeated beatings and his response.
correct.
Please continue.
Quote, that is totally untrue, close quote.
I want to stop you. Does that mean that when you asked Mr. Durst whether he had repeatedly beaten his wife, that his response was, that is totally untrue?
I believe so.
At the time that Mr. Durst was saying that to you, did you know whether or not that was a true statement he was giving to you? Did you know?
I did not.
Is it fair to say that as you sit there, you're interviewing Mr. Durst and you're asking questions, and the questions you're asking, you take the answers that he gives and you report them, but whether those answers are true, you can't comment about? Is that a correct statement?
Correct.
All right, please continue. Is she?
Yes. She has told that to there seems to be a typo here, I don't know. Let me try again. She has told that to, and I don't know what that means, never got the exact date. She has said, to the best of my knowledge, she was never admitted any place. I never beat her. Gilberta Najami from the very beginning has been trying to get us to break up. For whatever reason, she has never liked me.
Let me stop you. So I just want to be clear. So is it Mr. Durst that is saying, are these his words, I never beat her?
I believe so.
And, all right, please continue.
Quote, we've been having marital problems for several years. We were going back and forth.
What does the next line, do you know what that means? It looks like it's A-T-T-O-G-U-E-S. Do you know what that means?
I believe it's a typo. I believe it means attorneys.
Oh, attorneys, okay. Oh, all right. Go ahead.
And I'm basing that on the fact of what's coming up in the next sentence.
And then, is that going to be, that means you're asking him about attorneys, and this is going to be Mr. Durst's response?
Well, I'm not sure whether I asked him that question or not, but this is a quote, information from him from that interview.
Okay, go ahead.
Having lawyers involved in something, having lawyers counsel makes it very DIF, which I believe is my shorthand for difficult to...
And when you said you're shorthand, that's how you would sometimes write difficult DIF.
Yes.
That another reason why you recognize these notes to be yours.
Yes.
Please continue.
To says HA, which I believe means have. Quote, last April, we were just about ready to settle things. Gilberta convinced Kathy to get different counsel. She convinced my wife that there was another law firm, ellipsis, that handled the Kennedy divorce. She had a good friend there. Against everything I tried to say, Kathy switched attorneys and went to Milbank Tweed.
And that last statement you read, is that a quote from Mr. Durst?
I believe so.
Please continue.
Well, there's a closed quote at the end of Milbank Tweed. And it says, he says that when they determined there was little involved, if I may go back for a second, I think little involved is in quotes. Monetarily, the case wound its way down to lower echelon lawyers. Quote, as they found out there was little involved, what I own is held up in trust, close quote. Dale Smolin, pretty much her first case. She got married and became Dale Reagan. A large part of the problem is that Kathy and the postnuptial accord, quote, I felt like we were getting close, close quote. That's where Gilberta Najami has been coming from. She doesn't hesitate to say anything. I hope that a New York paper would.
That was again Mr. Durst speaking.
I believe so.
Please continue.
Can you pull the paper?
Oh, I'm sorry. That's what you're looking for. I'll get better as we get to the next page, I promise.
Jan 16, I don't remember what happened. Saturday, parentheses, MO dash, presumably meaning January 16th, close parentheses, we were in Denver. January 16 is a Sat. If she checked into Jacoby Hospital, we were never in Denver at cousin's wedding, Friday afternoon, and went Sunday.
Read that? Yes, as we were in Denver.
Sorry, my apologies, sorry, sir, sorry. That's absurd, totally absurd. A weekend there are a dozen, parentheses, of witnesses, close parentheses. Kathy hurt her knees. She fell down and hurt her knees out jogging, ellipsis, parentheses, or walking the dog, close parentheses. That is only time she could have been hospitalized.
That was Mr. Durst speaking.
I believe so.
At the time, having reviewed this, does it appear, Mr. Lachman, that you were aware or had information about an alleged hospitalization involving Kathy Durst on January 16th at Jacoby Hospital?
Yes,
And in terms of that January 16th date, then Mr. Durst is responding that that could not have been the date, could not have been hospitalized because they were dead, or is that correct?
I believe so, yes.
Is there any indication that you asked him about hospitalization at Jacobi Hospital on January 6th?
I don't have an indication based on these notes.
So, is it fair to say then that you are, in your question, presupposing the incident that happened on a certain date, and then Mr. Durst is responding to you about that date, is that correct?
I believe so.
All right. Please continue. Did you get to the end of this page? Did you read the hospitalized part? Yes?
Yes.
Okay.
I wanted a divorce unless we were post-marital, post-nuptial agreement. Quote, my wife sought a divorce in May, a baby, and decided she didn't want a divorce. I felt I wasn't about to go through it again. I insisted we work out an agreement so that in the future, if my wife wanted to divorce me, parentheses, wouldn't have to go through the legal hassles and disclosures, close parentheses. November 80 until Jan 82, working on the post-nuptial agreement. Kathy absolutely did not want a divorce. She wanted to be happily married. It's very, very unpleasant making a disclosure, ellipsis, making financial disclosures if your family has assets and trusts. None of that stuff is disclosed out of the family since my uncle got divorced 25 years ago. We had a big argument about it. I went and made financial disclosures, gave out documents, which I was, the typo here, I believe it says very hesitant to give out because I have to bring in family attorneys and family counsel. And ellipsis, you gotta go ahead and resolve this thing. His family gave him advice, colon, as a result of marrying you, she's going to college, she's going to medical school. That was more or less resolved.
Is the area you just read that started with I wanted a divorce and ended with that was more or less resolved, was that all Bob Durst quotes to you?
I believe so.
All right, please continue.
Prudence Farrow, quote, my wife and I didn't live together from May or June of 80 until she moved into my Riverside Drive apartment in April. I can't read the date. Bear with me a moment. During that time, we both had relationships, close quote. What was relationship with Prudence when Kathy disappeared, colon, quote, not an intimate relationship, period, close quote. Kathy was going out with some interesting people too. March 81, November 81. I didn't see anybody else. Prudence, colon, quote, she doesn't really like me very much anymore, especially after Mary Hughes and Gilberta, close quote, called her.
Can you stop you? All of those comments about Prudence Farrow, were those Bob Durst? Were those his quotes?
I believe so.
Go ahead, we've gone to the last page now.
Payphone, ellipsis, The call was from a payphone.
Let me stop you. This means, again, payphone ellipsis, that's your shorthand for you're now going to be asking him about issues with the payphone, and it's going to be his response, Mr. Durst.
I believe so.
Please continue.
The phone was at a restaurant, Tata's Rest, which is my shorthand for restaurant. I went to Tata's. Kathy already had dinner that night. 11-11:30 p.m. Quote, she'd come back from Gilberta angry as hell at me, close quote.
Let me stop you. Does that mean that Mr. Durst told you that when she got home, the night she disappeared, that she was, quote, angry as hell at me? That's coming from Mr. Durst.
I believe so.
When you say you believe so, you would not have given your opinion about Kathy's mood the night she came home, correct?
She had developed where she drank frequently. Numerous incompletes in medical school, primarily because she was drunk a lot. Kathy got back from Gilberta's house very, very drunk. She wanted to go right to the city. She couldn't drive. That's why I took her to the station. We had planned on staying the week. Geraldine.
And what you just were quoting from where it said payphone, and you said the call was from a payphone all the way down to Geraldine, was that information that was provided by Mr. Durst?
I believe so.
Other than Mr. Durst providing you this information, at the time you were interviewing him, or afterwards, did you in any way attempt to verify the information he provided?
I don't remember.
Is it fair to say, Mr. Lachman, that your role as a reporter, you were interviewing Mr. Durst, you were getting answers to questions that you asked him, and you were printing those answers. You ask a question, he gives you an answer, and you're printing those answers without critically analyzing in your stories whether those answers appear to be false, true, etc. Is that a fair statement of what your role was in writing these articles?
Well, I think it's a little more complicated than a yes or no.
Explain.
Well, a reporter wants to be taking interviews with the people involved in the story, and he or she should do the best to check out the information. On a story like this, where we had some damaging information about Mr. Durst, we went to him, he agreed to speak to us, and I think we kind of put both of those sides into the story. And I have to leave it at that.
My final question is, what I'm asking you is in conducting an interview with Mr. Durst, was your role, as you believe, in the middle of the interview, for you to say to him, as an example, Mr. Durst, you say you haven't beaten your wife. What about blah, blah, blah? Was that what you viewed your role at the time you conducted the interview with Mr. Durst?
Well, we had information about his relationship with Kathy, and we wanted his response. So we had that back and forth going.
Right, and so what I'm basically asking you, Mr. Black, was in the end, you're asking Mr. Durst questions, you're getting his responses. You're not there to go after his responses in any greater detail than simply question and answer.
I think we put both sides of the story into this article.
Thank you. Another for everyone.
And now the cross-examination.
Good morning again, Mr. Lachman.
Morning.
Did you record your interview with Mr. Durst?
I don't remember.
Did you have the equipment to record interviews, tape recorders? Back in the,
Yes.
where did the interview take place?
To the best of my memory, it took place at a public relations office.
Company that had done work for Durst firms, if you recall?
I believe so.
Okay. But you don't have a memory of recording the interview?
I don't.
Have anybody asked you to search and see if there is a recording?
No.
So Mr. Leland's never asked you to look for any kind of tape recording?
No.
Any of the police from LA that have been associated with this asked you for the recording?
No.
Do you have the spot? You think that that might still exist in your own personal possession?
No.
How many times did you actually speak to Mr. Durst?
I have a memory of speaking to him once. I'll call it a big interview, the sit-down conversation. But I may have spoken to him prior to that as well.
As a reporter, an investigative reporter, when you are sitting down with the person that you're interviewing, before you get there, you conceptualize what it is you're going to be looking for?
Yes.
Okay. And in this instance, your focus from the last few answers you gave probably was on the relationship between Mr. Durst and his wife?
Yes.
Because you were trying to figure out factually the nature of the relationship, correct?
Yes.
At any time when you were talking to Mr. Durst and asking him questions, either in your memory or in the notes that you've had several opportunities to review along the way, did Mr. Durst ever say to you, "I'm not answering that question"?
I don't recall.
And do you have, from the review of the notes, is there anything in your notes that you've reviewed up till now that suggests to you that Mr. Durst ever refused to answer one of your questions?
Based on these notes, there's nothing to indicate that.
And of course, if in the course of interviewing somebody for a story, you ask a question to which the person either refuses to respond or says no comment, that's something that an experienced reporter like yourself would know, correct?
I think that's fair to say.
In the interview, was anybody else present when you interviewed him? If you remember.
I kind of remember. I couldn't say for certain.
Let me ask you this. Early on, Mr. Lewin referenced the fact that your lawyers and the district attorney's office negotiated some guidelines for your testimony. Is that correct?
Yes.
Did Mr. Durst or his lawyers or any representative from the public relation firm negotiate the terms of your interview with Mr. Durst?
Back in the 80s.
Yes.
I don't remember.
Do you have any record anywhere that anybody told you these are the ground rules, these questions are okay, these questions are off base, anything like that? Any memory of that?
No, sir.
And again, that would be something that a journalist with your experience would know, correct? If somebody had said to you, we're going to conduct this interview, but these are the rules, you'd have made a record of that, correct?
It's possible.
You certainly would have gone to your editor, correct?
I probably would have ran by in a hurry.
Now, you had, as you said, received information suggesting domestic issues, correct?
Yes.
And at any time after you spoke to Mr. Durst and he gave you all of the statements that Mr. Lewin elicited, you were free to investigate the veracity of those statements, were you not?
Yes.
It was a big story, correct?
Yes.
Your career suggests, based on what, you know, your noteworthy history with a show like Inside Edition, that investigative journalism is something that is important to you, correct?
Yes.
And an investigative reporter's job is to ferret out the truth, correct?
Yes.
So if you have a person that is a subject of a story giving you an unfettered interview, answering whatever questions you want, when you're done with that, you're free to test the credibility of what was said to you, correct?
Yes.
Now, you were the reporter in the street that sent your colleague factual information for some of the original stories that were written about the Durst matter, correct?
Use the word street. It's possible that I was door knocking various locations and calling it into Masha. It's possible also that I was working the phones. We were splitting the work. It's possible. It just happened so long ago. I couldn't tell you exactly.
In preparing to testify, were you shown those previous articles?
Yes.
Do you recall that you, with a byline and Marcia, reported that Mr. Durst had offered a $100,000 reward for information about the disappearance of his wife?
I recall reading that article.
Okay, in 1982, 100,000. In 2018, 100,000 is a nice number. In 1982, that's a very large number, is it not?
I think that's fair to say.
He also informed you, or Marcia was in your story, that he had hired a very experienced investigator who was known for finding missing people, correct?
I believe that's in one of the articles.
And of course, you were reporting information in the early stories, not only to be a reporter, but there was hope that your stories might, what's the word, trigger something in a reader that might provide a lead to the police, correct?
I think that's fair to say.
I mean, you even went as far as to publish phone numbers for the Durst headquarters and for the detective who was involved, correct?
I believe so.
It was kind of a public service gesture by the Post at the time, correct?
In a way, yes.
By the way, one of the notes indicated that Bob was described as a hippie. For us old-timers, that meant someone who was peaceful and loving, did it not? Sir, what would you grew up in the same neck of the woods as me at the same time. How would you define a hippie?
Well, I think you used the words peaceful and loving, and I think some hippies were like that and other hippies were not.
Sir, in the course of being an investigative reporter, you go out, as you said earlier, and knock on doors, correct?
Yes.
In this instance, not only did you speak to Mr. Durst, but you spoke to friends and family members of captives, correct?
Yes.
And you are a very congenial gentleman. In the course of that, did you develop friendships or relationships with any of those people?
I wouldn't use those words. I would say that I got to know them.
And they gave you access to whatever information they had, correct?
They spoke to me.
Sir, did you or anybody on your behalf investigate how your notes got in the hands of the police?
No,
Were you surprised when you found out that your notes were in the hands of the police?
yes, yes it was.
Did you inquire of the district attorney or the Los Angeles Police Department where they got your notes?
I believe I did.
And they told you they got them from East Coast policemen, correct?
I asked the New York State Police and the Westchester County DA's office, who came to visit me in my office in New York, where they got the notes. And my recollection of the conversation is that they wouldn't tell me. The DA here, I believe, got the notes from the New York authorities.
In your experience, did reporters at the New York Post, without going into specific names or examples, provide information to the police in exchange for cooperation with the police?
Each story is different. News organizations very often have contacts and relationships with local law enforcement. They report the stories. Sometimes the cops like them, sometimes they don't. I'm not aware of any situation where it's quid pro quo. You earlier referenced the fact that when the New York Post published the phone number as a public service, so if a news organization, not just the Post, but any news organization, does a story and missing kid, missing woman, we get a call, hey, I think I saw so-and-so at this location. So in a situation like that, I think it's fair for a news organization to reach out to the cops, because we don't have the resources probably to investigate that particular account. So in a sense, there is some degree of cooperation, but it's back in, it's story specific. That's the way I have of answering that question.
All right, it is our noon recess. We'll return at 1:30. We'll return at 1:30. Thank you. Back in session, the People versus Robert Durst. Mr. Lachman is resuming the witness stand. Mr. Durst is here with his lawyers. The people are represented. Mr. Lachman, I'm going to remind you to turn the oath, and that you may continue with your cross-examination.
This will just be brief, sir. Just focusing on the portions of the stories that you were writing regarding problems in marriage or domestic violence, those kind of things. Did you rely on police sources for that information?
I don't remember.
Is there anything that you, in your notes, that helped refresh your recollection as to whether or not it was police sources?
I don't think so. My reading of the notes from this morning didn't seem to quote any police sources.
Thank you, Mr. President. Please, redirect.
Yes, very brief.
Yeah.
Mr. Lachman, you were asked questions by defense counsel about materials that I, the district attorney's office, specifically asked for. You were asked by counsel whether I asked for the recordings in this case you had. Do you recall those questions by Mr. Chestnut?
Yes.
Did you and your attorneys make it clear to me, Mr. Lachman, that you would not give me any materials that I did not already have possession of because of your journalistic shield?
Yes.
Have you previously related to me in a taped interview that it is your position that those notes were not wrongfully acquired, taken by the police, but were instead provided by somebody you had willingly given the notes to?
I think in our previous conversation, I told you that I did not give the notes to, I didn't know how the New York State Police got the notes. To this day, I still don't know. And in that conversation that we had, I indicated to you that it may be, it was speculation on my part, it may be that at some point I may have given the notes to family members for their perusal. Whether that happened or not, I still don't know.
Did you also relate, though, during our conversation, that it was not your position that the police had somehow unlawfully acquired your notes, broken into the post, etc.? In other words, have you at any point alleged that the New York State Police or New York Police Department or any law enforcement agency wrongfully acquired your notes?
No.
Thank you. No further questions.
Mr. Lewin asked questions regarding your theory as to how the police may have gotten your notes, correct?
Yes.
And you, at the time, both before we were in court and here in court, were willing to tell Mr. Lewin that you believe that they may have been given to the police by family members as a result of you giving the family members the notes, correct?
I speculated that that might have been what happened.
Okay. With that said, Your Honor, I won't ask any more questions.
Okay, redirect examination. Mr. Martin, you're excused.
Your Honor, we've completed People 74. It's the video testimony of Charles Lachman. We can mark as People 74B for identification. It's a sheet referencing the exhibits from the video, the new exhibits for trial. We'll mark as People 74C for identification. It's a 2-page article. That was People 74 in the video. We'll mark as People 74D, as in dog, a 5-page notes. That was People 75 in the video. And I believe, Your Honor, it is approximately 3 o'clock for the afternoon break.
All right, it's a little early, but how long is the next video?
23 minutes.
All right, let's take our break until 10 minutes after 3 p.m. Do not converse among yourselves or with anyone else on any subject connected with this case. Do not form or express anything on the case. We will see you at 3:10.